Good afternoon. My name is Emilie van Deventer, and I'm the team leader of the radiation program at the World Health Organization. I would like to thank the organizers for inviting WHO to participate in this meeting, and I wish very much that I could be amongst you this afternoon to share this very interesting program. This is the outline of my presentation. I will first briefly describe WHO and its International EMF Project, and then summarize the current scientific knowledge regarding radio frequency fields and health, and how we develop health risk assessments before a discussion on the challenges as we see for 5G moving ahead. In terms of the World Health Organization, this is the international agency within the United Nations system that is responsible for health and public health. And WHO experts help countries to address public health issues from non-communicable diseases such as cancer, diabetes, obesity, to communicable diseases such as Ebola and Zika. And our work really relates to environmental health. WHO supports very much health research, and we have over 8,000 public health experts in 147 country offices, 6 regional offices, and at our headquarters in Geneva, Switzerland. In this slide, I show the definition of health as developed in the Constitution of WHO in 1948. Health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not just the absence of disease or infirmity. This is a very wide definition of health, and I will come back to it later in my presentation. In terms of the context as we see it with respect to EMF, we see very much an increasing exposure from people due to electricity, to medical technologies, to wireless devices, wireless networks, and this prompts a concern from at least a part of the population. On this slide, you will see some of the classical applications that use radio frequency fields as defined in part of the spectrum between 100 kHz and 300 GHz. We're talking here about telecommunications, navigation, radar, broadcasting, some sources within the home, such as microwave oven or induction stove or the baby monitor, and as well as commercial applications and applications in farming, in vehicular technologies, and so on. Over time, we have seen quite a bit of public concern relating to exposure to radio frequency fields. It started really in the early 2000s with worry from the use of mobile phones and maybe head and neck cancers, to more recently a shift to applications and concern from base station. Then it was the Wi-Fi in schools, and now the smart meters, which are electronic devices that record the consumptions of electric energy and help monitor and the billing of your consumption. As the topic of this meeting relates to 5G technologies, I just wanted to include a slide showing some of these exciting new possibilities that 5G will enable And I believe you would have heard from Mike Wood this morning about the very different and varied applications. With the deployment of this technology looming on the horizon, we already are seeing and hearing concern voiced by members of the public, but also some researchers warning of the potential health effects of 5G. And it is because of such concern, both from the general public and governments, about these potential health effects, that the International EMF Project was established already 21 years ago with the goal of investigating health effects of EMF and advising national authorities on radiation protection. There is an effort to provide information and advice to member states and the public, as well as workers exposed to such field. The project is open to any member state government department or representative of national institutions. The World Health Organization very much engages in partnerships with member states, the 194 member states that constitute the WHO, but also with international organizations within the UN system and outside, with collaborating centers, which are often academic or national institutions doing research or advocacy, and finally non-governmental organizations. And in the context of radiation, we work with NGOs such as ICNIRP, the International Commission on Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection, ICO, the International Commission on Occupational Health, and for ionizing radiation with the International Commission of Radiological Protection. We also have much dealings with others such as ERSI or IEEE ISIS, and these form the basis of the expertise that we deal with. For those of you who are not familiar with our work, most of our activities can be summarized on this slide, dealing mostly with the assessment of the risk by looking at the scientific evidence. Another pole of activity is developing policy positions for risk management, and finally developing risk communication tools and analyzing the public concern and the risk perception aspects of the issue of EMF. And for each of these areas, we have developed over time a number of documents that you can find on our website. Next, I will discuss how we actually assess the risks to health from radio frequency fields. The evidence to date stems from quite a large and increasingly sophisticated database of published papers. There are known mechanisms about the biological effects from EMF exposures which are well understood, such as, for example, at RF frequencies heating, and there are international exposure limits or guidelines that are based on these established health effects. But there's still scientific uncertainty, mostly due to the fact that the technologies are continuously changing and that we do not have very much hindsight in terms of health effects from these technologies. So what do we know at present? I think that all the scientists in the room will understand well that low frequency fields, for example 50 Hz, are quite different from radio frequency fields. The physical properties are different, and so will be the interaction of the fields and the body. So in terms of the mechanisms of interactions, we have a good knowledge of the mechanisms that can occur when the fields are strong enough so that at low frequency you would be able to see induced electric currents. We can stimulate nerves and muscles, and at very high frequencies you will see heating due to the displacement of ions and water molecules in the medium that they cross. And between about 100 kilohertz and 10 gigahertz, these two mechanisms actually coexist with a relative importance which varies with frequency. As we go up in frequency, we will see more surface heating of the skin because the fields will penetrate less deeply into the human body. These are the well-known effects. Now, over the past couple of decades, the researchers have really been spending a lot of effort and energy looking whether there are any non-thermal effects at those radio frequency fields. So when we are talking about 5G, we are actually expecting to see the technology encompassing fields and signals below 1 gigahertz, between 1 and 6 gigahertz, and above 6 gigahertz, most likely around the 24 gigs. But I understand that the actual spectrum for 5G is not completely finalized, so it's a little bit difficult to give more details at this point in time. But in terms of the mechanisms of interaction, we are already quite familiar with those at the frequencies of interest. In order to assess the health risks from these fields, we actually seek information through different types of studies. Scientific studies relating to environmental health are usually based on two types: those that are carried in a laboratory setting, on cells, on animals, or on human volunteers, and those that are carried in everyday life, which we call epidemiological studies. All of these studies provide valuable information, but no single study or type of study can actually give a definitive answer. So I would like to show you some examples on the next slide. This slide describes some of the laboratory studies that have been performed. First, with respect to cellular studies, the endpoints studied have been mostly on genotoxicity and gene expression. With regard to animal studies, the endpoints have been related to cancer, to behavior, to the blood-brain barrier, and to the skin. And for human studies, because of ethical reasons, we are able to study only certain parameters and health outcomes, and these include sleep, the brain, the EEG type of measurements, also hormones, and as well as electrical hypersensitivity, which is a set of symptoms that some people attribute to exposure to radio frequency fields. In epidemiological studies, we follow a population in its everyday setting. And one of the important information that we need to gather is actually mapping out as accurately as possible the exposure of the people with respect to the agent at hand, in this case radio frequency fields. And for RF, the exposure comes mostly on one hand from the devices that are in close proximity to the human body, such as a mobile phone or a laptop, and on the other hand from environmental fields that are emitted at a certain distance, such as a base station antenna or a wireless LAN. Several epidemiological investigations have been undertaken to study any association between the use of mobile phones and different health outputs or endpoints, especially brain cancer. And since the mid-90s in the US and Scandinavia, there were several studies looking at a number of tumors in the head and neck. And the largest to date is still the Interphone study that was a collaboration of cooperation of about 13 countries coordinated by the International Agency for Research on Cancer, and that provided a great deal of data and a lot of analysis on the potential biases that one can get doing a case control study of that type. There are a number of ongoing studies on adults, on children, and including a prospective cohort study in half a dozen of European countries. This study should hopefully last between 15 and 20 years, and the idea is to follow a group of mobile phone users and study various pathologies, not just cancer, but a number of those. And the advantage of such type of studies is that you don't have the problem of recall bias that has plagued a number of the case control studies, but it does require patience and financing over a long term. A common concern about radio frequency fields relates to the possible long-term health effects that whole body exposure from antennas at a distance, such as a base station, may have. The studies that have been published have in the past had methodological problems and great difficulties at assessing the exposure from the base station compared with other radio frequency sources. At present, we have now quite good and sophisticated personal dosimeters, and we do not see any evidence that base stations could have a detrimental health effects with the very weak exposure that they give to the general population. And we do not see any reported health problems for other RF sources such as radio or TV or radar. And we very much are of the opinion that if there were a risk, it would be considerably easier to detect this in studies of mobile phone users or highly exposed occupational groups. The health risk assessment of any environmental agent is usually performed using this four-step classical paradigm, where we start with the hazard identification, and in the case of radio frequency fields for WHO, the International Agency for Research on Cancer has reviewed the carcinogenicity potential of RF fields and published a monograph in 2013 where they classified RF as possibly carcinogenic to humans, that is group 2B. This classification was based on limited evidence in humans looking at the positive association between glioma and acoustic neuroma and exposure to RF fields from wireless telephones. They saw limited evidence in experimental animals and weak mechanistic evidence. But one has to clarify that the evidence for all other exposures, for example from base stations or from Wi-Fi and for other outcomes, other types of cancers, was considered insufficient for any conclusions. The International EMF Project is looking at developing all 4 steps beyond the hazard identification from cancer, looking at all studied outcomes, assessing the exposure, and from there trying to develop an exposure response curve and characterizing the risk. We have been working on a monograph on radiofrequency fields, and the appraisal of the evidence for health risks will result actually in 2 documents. First of all, a scientific literature review that is to be published as a WHO technical document, and this review will include conclusions for the clear-cut health outcomes and will recommend systematic analysis for health outcomes for which the evidence does not provide a consensus. In a second step, the RFEHC monograph will elaborate on those health outcomes that have been highlighted in the review process, and a task group will be required to finalize the conclusions for all these health outcomes that have been reviewed and developing research recommendations and providing this health risk assessment. I have to say that when I was invited to give a presentation at this meeting relating to 5G, EMF and health, I wondered if it is too early to discuss this point. So one of the challenges that we see is really the assessment of the exposure. With the type of antennas that will be used for 5G, it looks like using these advanced technologies such as beamforming will provide beams that move both in times and in space and vary quite a bit. So it will be quite a difficulty for epidemiologists to know the type of exposures that people will have had. Another challenge that we see very much is in terms of assessing the compliance. And we are very much in agreement with this GSMA brochure that came out a couple months ago that mentioned that we will have some questions with regard to the size of the compliance zones, and this is something that will need to be further assessed. On the other hand, maybe it's not too early to discuss this point, and maybe we do have already some information at hand. If you look at the EMF portal, which is a database of research studies from around the world, you will see that there are already quite a sizable amount of scientific literature that has been published, at least in some part of the foreseen 5G spectrum. But maybe a more important question is whether exposure to radio frequency fields from wireless technologies is actually the main health concern. I mentioned that I would come back to the definition of health. And even if the physical agent, in this case the radiation, is not harmful, there may be aspects of the technology that hinder mental and social well-being. And this is the topic of much research at present, beyond the confines of radiation health effect research. Just 4 weeks ago, the Interdisciplinary Summit on Children and Screen Time met in Washington, D.C. to discuss on a number of very important topics related to the technologies at hand. On one hand, we talked about cognitive, psychosocial, and the physical effects of mobile telephony, laptops, tablets, and so on learning, on attention, on sleep, on anxiety, the effects on the family and the society and the culture, and also the usage, for example, relating to violence and cyberbullying. They defined 3 very urgent questions that they wanted to study and research. And in the volume of last month of the Pediatrics Journal, there was a full supplement dedicated to the topic of children, adolescents, and screens, what we know and what we need to learn. When developing such new technologies that will have far-reaching consequences, we urge you to think about these aspects of the technology that you as industry plan to put on the market and you as government plan to provide and promote to your citizens. So we feel that there is a need for clear roles and responsibilities in the government on this topic, that there needs to be the adoption and compliance of health-based standards at the national level, and that there should be some public information programs and dialogue with all stakeholders. And for countries that can afford it, to promote research to reduce any further uncertainty. Thank you very much.